Hello everybody, Julian Charles here of themindrenewed.com, coming to you as usual from the depths of the Lancashire countryside here in the UK, and today I am very pleased to welcome to the programme Peter Ford, who is a retired, or technically retired, British diplomat who served as UK ambassador to Bahrain from 1999 until 2003, and then ambassador to Syria from 2003 until 2006. He has been very outspoken in his criticism of British foreign policy in recent years, especially that towards Syria, a country, of course, that he knows and understands extremely well. Peter Ford, thank you very much indeed for joining us on The Mind Renewed.
Thank you, Julian, for the invitation.
It's great of you to come on, great to have the opportunity to speak to you, because I became aware of your criticism of mainstream media journalism and news reporting a few years ago, and I have noticed how you've consistently, and I think bravely, dropped, as it were, truth bombs into many of your interviews that you've had on TV and radio, and it's been quite refreshing, a breath of fresh air for somebody like me to hear that. Somebody with a distinguished diplomatic background to, articulate those truths, which should really be spoken by journalists themselves. So it's great to be hearing that, and thank you for doing that. I recently noticed that you'd also been a speaker at the Media on Trial event in Leeds, where Vanessa Beeley spoke, who we spoke to recently, and I was very interested in what you had to say there, so I'll be asking you about that as well. Before we get into all that kind of thing to do with the mainstream media, I'd like to ask a little bit about your background. As I said in the introduction, you're twice UK ambassador to these various places. How did you have a career path such as that?
Well, from a quite early age, possibly from watching the film Lawrence of Arabia, I became passionate about the Middle East, and I thought that being a Foreign Office diplomat would be the best passport to that area. And so I took that to pass. I studied languages at university, took the civil service exam, was lucky enough to get chosen for the Foreign Office, and very soon after joining, volunteered to learn Arabic. The die was cast.
Wow, Arabic. So you are a fluent Arabic speaker.
Yes, I managed somehow to keep it up. I managed the other day to stumble through a radio interview in Arabic, and they told me it was very good.
Wow. I have studied a little bit of languages myself, but I'm not a language person, so I'm in awe at anybody who can speak a language like that. I understand from your Wikipedia page that when you retired, you became a representative to the Commissioner General of UNRWA? Yeah. Could you tell us something about that organisation?
Yeah, that's the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. And their job is to basically look after the millions of Palestinian refugees whose forebears go back to the events of 1947, the Nakba. And there are hundreds of thousands of them spread over several countries of the Middle East. And my job for UNRWA was to raise funds to help support these Palestinian refugees with schooling, healthcare, social support, housing. It was focused on raising money in the Gulf countries, in several of which I'd previously served with the Foreign Office. It was horses for courses. And I'm glad to say I was very successful in raising literally hundreds of millions of dollars for this very good cause.
Marvellous. Now, I'm going to ask you a question here about the British Syrian Society. I don't know anything about this. I wonder if you could tell us what that is. And also, as you know, this tends to come up in some of your media appearances, that it's associated with Bashar al-Assad's father-in-law. And this is, taken as a black mark against you. Anyway, could you tell us something about the British Syrian Society?
Surely. The Society has several hundred members here in the UK and in Syria. It's been going perhaps for 10, 12 years. That is, it predates the conflict. And it's basically a sort of pro-reform ginger group. Now, it's correct that the first founding chairman of the group is Dr. Fawaz Akhras, who happens to be father-in-law of President Assad. Dr. Achras is a cardiologist resident in London who likes to do good works and promote the cause of reform in Syria. Is very strong on the anti-corruption drives that have taken place in Syria. And previous boards of the society have traditionally included former British ambassadors to Syria, including Lord Andrew Green, now a member of the House of Lords and back on the board of the British Syrian Society. In the last few years, the society in this country has been quiescent. It has been impossible to mount any events because of the cacophony of propaganda against the society. It has, however, mounted reform-oriented events in Syria itself, and that's what it continues to do. But it is not a lobbying outfit as it has been portrayed. I feel sorry for anybody who has a mandate to try to lobby for the Syrian government, a thankless task if ever there was one, and there's no money for it. The society has in the past arranged visits, information visits by MPs, including worthies such as David Davis, to go fact-finding to Syria. David Davis, incidentally, wrote a very interesting note on his return, which you'll find on his website. But at the moment, as I say, the society is virtually quiescent.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting how that is.
May I add?
Yes.
May I add that we're all volunteers.
Right.
None of the board receives a stipend. We do it for the love of it, for the love of Syria.
But it is interesting, isn't it, how that association with his father-in-law is often mentioned with respect to you, as if that somehow discredits you, and yet you're saying that has no weight to it whatsoever.
Exactly. This is typical. One newspaper, one of the prominent broadsheet newspapers, said erroneously that I had a job with President Bashar al-Assad's father-in-law. They were forced to retract by the Independent Press Standards Organization. It's not a job. It's simply a position. We meet about 3 times a year. If it was a job, I would be laughing, particularly if it was paid, which it isn't.
Right.
They were forced to retract. But this is typical of the smearing, which goes on to anybody who questions the preferred narrative of the mainstream media about Syria.
Yes, indeed. So just before we do, in fact, get on to talk more about the mainstream media, I wanted to ask you a little more about your position on Syria, just to establish for listeners who may not know you what your angle is on this country. When I spoke to Vanessa Beeley the other week, she said that before the so-called civil war in Syria, and now she made it quite clear to us it isn't really a civil war, but that's all part of the propaganda. Before the horrors, let's call them, started several years ago, Syria was, she said, quite a progressive country, relatively progressive, and quite stable place in the Middle East. Do you echo that? What was your experience of Syria during your time as ambassador?
Yes, I do very much echo that. I left in 2006, but I continued to visit Syria in my later job with the UN, which was only just down the road in Amman. I visited Damascus frequently before the outbreak of the conflict in 2011 and afterwards. And it used to be probably the most progressive place in the Middle East. It wasn't a paradise, a democratic paradise by any means, but it was taking steps forward towards economic and political reform. We were beginning to see an opening up of the economy in particular, which had been state-dominated. But Syria, including today, it has a government that looks after its people. It was providing among the best healthcare to any country in the Middle East, comparable, for example, to Cuba. And to this day, the government is very assiduous in looking after people. I came across a a small example. The other day, a group of refugees were returning from nearby Lebanon, going back to the home country, and they were met, they said, by a welcoming committee and doctors with vaccinations ready for the children. That is not the hallmark of a brutal dictator who wants to murder his people.
Indeed, and yet, as you've just sort of indicated there, we have constantly been having this phrase come across our ears, which is that he's been killing his own people. I remember in one of the presentations you gave, you said that what's been essentially happening with Assad is that the accusations against him have been exaggerated, which implies that he's certainly no saint, but that the case against him has been inflated for the purposes of propaganda. Have I read you right on that?
Yes, it's hard to know where to start. So copious has been the propaganda, but let's just start with the number of people allegedly killed. This is commonly trotted out that Assad has killed nearly 500,000 of his own people. Lie. That figure includes victims on both sides of the conflict, and it includes government soldiers as well as militants who have died. So the true figure of civilian victims of government attacks might be closer to 100,000. The statement is 1/4 true, perhaps, and 3/4 untrue. That's just one example of the factoids which are regularly trotted out about Syria. A factoid had a little grain of undeniable truth in it, but it is amplified, distorted to give a completely opposite impression to the real fact.
And of course, as you said, there's an awful lot that we could talk about to do with that exaggeration and propaganda. You said before the interview that you essentially agree with Vanessa Beeley's position on what's been going on. So to boil that down, that will be that Syria has been essentially experiencing a proxy war waged by the West and its allies using jihadists for the purposes of toppling Assad and gaining control over that country. So would you essentially agree with that as a summary of what's been going on?
Basically, yes. I'm not denying that back in 2011, many Syrian people, seeing what had happened across North Africa, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, thought that this was the moment to go out and demonstrate against a government which was quite heavy-handed at times. No one says that the government were angels, but which government in the Middle East has ever been angelic? But very, very quickly, foreign powers intervened to arm the rebels and to add fuel to the flames. And at various times since, many, many outside powers have intervened on the side of the rebels, pumping in literally billions of dollars in armaments and other help with propaganda. Maybe we'll come back to that. And political help at the United Nations and elsewhere. And this includes some countries with very, very deep pockets. Poor Syria, one of the poorest countries in the Middle East, has been set upon by a gang of rogues in the Gulf, among the Gulf leadership, with very deep pockets indeed. And they have been ready to sustain renegade armies, mercenary armies, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Nusra, a whole rogues gallery of jihadi militias, some of them bigger than the British Army, funded largely by the Gulf states and by the United States. It's almost a miracle that the Syrian government has been able to survive.
So you see the West and these Gulf states working in tandem. Do you see that as an outworking of what General Wesley Clark said several years ago about, he was told by somebody at the Pentagon that the Pentagon was going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, and of course Syria was on that list. Is that in your understanding or an outworking of that plan?
Without a shadow of a doubt. I remember from my own time in the Foreign Office at the time of the Iraq war, it was common knowledge that once the Americans had dealt with Iraq, it was going to be Syria's turn next.
Right. Well, indeed.
It didn't happen quite so quickly because the Americans got bogged down in Iraq, and the Syrian government, rather nefariously, helped to make sure they got bogged down precisely so that they would not come knocking on Damascus's door next.
Right, yeah. Now, Professor Piers Robinson in the Media on Trial event actually mentioned a British Embassy cable, which echoes what you've just been saying there. This is cited in the Chilcot report, which reads, quote, "The regime change hawks in Washington are arguing that a coalition put together for one purpose, which is this is reaction to 9/11, could be used to clear up other problems in the region." I thought that was an amazing quote to bring out. There were indeed other things on the list.
And it goes on. There is now a new sheriff in the Middle East town, as it were, the self-styled Global Coalition for the Elimination of ISIS. Now, this organization, which includes about 50 countries, but is certainly not global. It doesn't include the countries that represent most of humanity. But anyway, a large coalition. And they have months and months ago virtually eliminated ISIS from both Iraq and Syria. But they seem intent on finding a new purpose for themselves by attacking the Syrian army and its allies. Our own revered RAF recently killed members of one of the militias supporting the government. What this has to do with eradicating ISIS, I really don't know. But it's deliberate mission creep. The real purpose of this global coalition is now clearly not to remove the few remaining pockets of ISIS, but to prevent the Assad government from reasserting control over about 30% of the country, which is effectively in the control of the coalition.
You mentioned that while you were British ambassador, you had a very definite sense that this sort of thing was going on. How did that actually affect your work? Did it make it extremely difficult?
Well, conditions were different in that I was able to feed back opinions and information to London, which I hoped would make them be cautious about joining in this enterprise of the Americans. And fortunately, this enterprise didn't get very far for the reason I mentioned earlier, that the Americans got bogged down in Iraq. But I frequently did have to go to make representations to the Syrians to plead with them to stop the flow of jihadis across their border into Iraq to fight the Americans. But I explained to London that we had only ourselves to blame because the Americans had so blatantly advertised their intention to go after Assad once they'd gotten rid of Saddam.
I'm picking up vibes these days that the war in Syria looks like it might be nearing its end. But do you think there's a danger that the false flags and the hoaxes that we've seen involving alleged chemical weapons could be yet again used as an excuse to fan the whole thing into flames? I did ask Vanessa that question, and she seems to think that that is a very real danger.
Yes, there's no room for complacency just because very recently several hundred of these white helmets, these so-called volunteer rescue workers, have been removed from the theatre of war. There are more of these white helmets who are actively preparing the next staged alleged chemical weapons incident in the province of Idlib right now. And this has very, very terrifying prospect because last time, you'll recall, with Duma in April, after that, the Western powers said, that'll teach Assad a lesson, and if he does it again, he'll see what he'll see. In other words, they have painted themselves into a corner. If there is another incident of some description, they have more or less made it inevitable that they will bomb Syria more heavily. And this time, I doubt that the Russians and the Iranians and the Syrians will just allow Syria to be treated as a punch bag for the West. There will be repercussions.
So do you understand that then as being actually a policy as far as the West is concerned, actually, to put your aircraft carrier in place and say, we're ready for anything lock, stock and barrel and make those statements very clearly so that the jihadists can hear that in order to precipitate such an event? I mean, do you see that as a policy?
Yes, on the part of some elements, anyway, in the American and British governments. I don't think that is at all in President Trump's calculations, but we saw last time how easy Trump is to manipulate.
Sure.
He saw a few pictures and launched his gunboats with their missiles. But I believe that there is a very deliberate intention to try to recoup lost ground on the battlefield by deploying this, I won't call it diplomacy, this gunboat warfare, again, more heavily in the hope of decapitating the Syrian state. This is the last hope for the regime changers of striking a blow which would decapitate the Syrian state. They don't think through the consequences any more than they did removing Saddam, what would follow, but these forces are intent on regime change.
Yes, I remember in one of your interviews you said something along those lines. You were saying it would be a really bad idea to get rid of Assad because of the chaos that would follow. And that was used against you in the interview because I think it was Emily, I can't think of her name now. I think this was on Newsnight. She said, does that mean you think everything's okay in Syria or something like that, which I thought was a remarkable response, really.
Yes, one never gets a fair hearing. When I'm being interviewed with the mainstream media, I get the feeling that I'm being interrogated by a press agent for the government.
Yeah.
And they will parrot the government position. Even their body language is sneering and dismissive. And they clearly resent having to give airspace to an alternative narrative.
Well, I want to ask you about a few of your appearances in a minute, but I would also like to ask you about the Media on Trial event, which I did ask Vanessa Beeley about. And she said that the event, in her opinion, was essentially a kind of mental space for people to gather, to hear critique, but also to share their own concerns about what's happening in the media and in the world. Is that your understanding of these events, that they are a kind of mental space for people?
Yes, that's one of their functions. I think on another level, they're a manifestation of what you might call populism. The same wave of sentiment that has brought about regime change of a sort in America and helped to bring on Brexit, helped to get Jeremy Corbyn elected leader of the Labour Party. This vague feeling of discontent with mainstream narratives, the narratives of the main parties. Even in France, Macron came from nowhere outside the framework of the big parties. And in the same way, people across Western democracies are showing a disenchantment with what they're being spoon-fed by governments, echoed by their agents in the mainstream media. I think these talks, this series of panel meetings, has struck a chord.
Yes, so it is a manifestation of that sentiment. What do you hope to achieve through actually doing it? I mean, there are hundreds of people involved, but not thousands, tens of thousands, millions. Well, what's the goal here?
Well, in fact, there are millions thanks to the wonders of the internet. It wouldn't be worth doing it just for a few hundred people in the actual audience. But these events, as you know yourself, are viewed on YouTube and other sites by hundreds of thousands of viewers. So the aim is to increase consciousness that the public are being spoon-fed false narratives by government and their media acolytes. The mainstream media are definitely alarmed by this. If you look at the viewing figures, young people today in particular don't get their news from the BBC or CNN. No, they will turn first to internet sources.
I don't know whether you saw John Cleese was on Newsnight several days ago. Did you see that? And he was saying how very few people in the UK trust the mainstream media. And I thought that was delightful that he was there saying that, actually.
Exactly.
I enjoyed that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, okay, I want to ask you more about your experiences of interacting with particularly the mainstream media. That's what we're talking about. I mean, essentially, we're talking about that because things like the BBC, the Channel 4 here in the UK, CNN in the US, these are the types of organisations that we've been brought up to trust. And so it seems to me they have a special burden of honesty and trustworthiness, and we need to hold them to account. So I'm not saying for a moment that therefore everything in the alternative media is great. It's, it's just that there is this burden upon the mainstream media. So in holding them to account, let's discuss some more of your media appearances. The first thing I want to ask here is that obviously you are a person with considerable expertise on the, the Arab-speaking world. I would have thought that you'd be regularly invited onto news programs to give your expert opinion, particularly on Syria. Are you frequently invited to speak?
No, and I think it's for a reason that the views I advocate aren't welcome on mainstream media. Only do I get invited when the Syria crisis is red hot. And the great thing is that even the mainstream channels are desperate to get talking heads, particularly ones that can say something interesting. Don't forget that they're competing with each other. They are in the business not of information, but infotainment.
Yes, right.
I go into this quite deliberately, partly to entertain and to get my messages across within the entertainment by being pugnacious and occasionally humorous. It's part of a deliberate tactic.
Yes, you described yourself as a media tart, I think, in one of your presentations. So it's
yes,
very humorous,
because I will go on any channel. I think I may have scraped the bottom of the barrel when I went on Radio Hertfordshire. But you see, these things tend to build up. If you go on enough small radio shows, eventually the internet ensures that you get some attention, and then the other channels start pricking up their ears, and eventually in a red hot crisis such as we had last April, you quickly go viral, particularly if, as I did, I graduated from being interviewed by Radio Hertfordshire to Radio Scotland, which is not exactly one of the top radio stations, but I managed to make it interesting.
Oh, it was a wonderful interview. I'm going to ask you about that one, yeah.
Thank you. And yes. On the basis of that, they simply had to get me on to some of the TV shows. And from there, I graduated to American channels, where incidentally, I had a better, more respectful audience than on places like the BBC and Sky.
Is this your interview with Tucker Carlson? Is that the one?
Yes. Yeah. Fox News. Yes.
Right. He seems refreshingly open to reason on various matters. I wonder how he gets away with it.
Well, it's not that surprising because he is echoing views that were expressed by Trump, the candidate. Trump made clear when he was a candidate that he wanted to withdraw a lot of the American military presence in the Middle East. He said no more unnecessary wars costing us trillions. This was an important part of his appeal. And even to this day, he continues to show an intention to withdraw American forces from Syria. He's being constantly dragged back by deep state, the intelligence agencies, the Pentagon, but he keeps returning to the charge. This is what his core vote expected of him, to scale back American adventures in the Middle East. And this is what Fox are happy to hear about.
Okay, well, as you are frequently on the receiving end of propaganda techniques aimed at you and, of course, at the audience, let's agree on a kind of working definition of propaganda. Now, Piers Robinson sort of boiled this down to coercion. I think this is a very helpful way of looking at it, that it's about propaganda is about trying to change thought and behavior, not through consent, via reason, persuasion, anything like that. It's essentially through force. It's by trying to coerce the audience. Do you agree with that? I mean, I know it's a simplification, but do you basically agree with that position on propaganda?
Yeah, that's one way of describing it. Coercion, certainly. In diplomacy, we talk about coercive diplomacy, often a euphemism for sanctions, and a similar technique is used in information warfare, because that's what's going on. Info warfare, very consciously on every side. There is a battle for control of the narrative. This is how I see it mainly. It's a battle for control of the narrative. Governments try to grab the narrative. Usually mainstream media are content to act as government press agents, at least whenever it's an issue of national security. It's different when it's something like the NHS. The media will be brave then and criticize the government. But on issues of national security, they snap to attention and just parrot the government narrative. And of course, from the other side, we are trying to grab that narrative back or puncture holes in it, as with the alleged Duma incident.
Yes, I think you said in one of your presentations that the reaction of journalists to intelligence services seems to be more deferential than it is to politicians. How have we got here?
Good question. I'm not sure how we've got here, but we certainly have witnessed the fawning of the British media on the head of British internal security service known as MI5, Andrew Parker, who has recently emerged from the shadows, come out from under his stone, and is now given airtime whenever he wants it. A full speech of his was carried live by Sky TV. This doesn't even happen to people like Boris Johnson, this reverential worshipping of the security agencies. It's a very dangerous trend.
As if somehow they are quintessentially the nation or something like that, or they couldn't possibly be corrupt. That seems to be the attitude that's there.
Yes, the underlying assumption seems to be that these are the incorruptibles representing the deep nation. Governments come and go, but the military, and actually in the case of Britain and America, it's a symptom of our imperial and post-imperial behavior and hangovers.
Right.
In Britain, we still have this hankering after empire. We still haven't quite adjusted to it. And so we preen ourselves on our James Bondish alleged competencies, on our spies. We boast about having the best intelligence in the world. This is nonsense. Believe me, I used to be an insider. This is nonsense. Witness Iraq. This is all you have to remember.
Yes.
A reader of newspapers could have told you better about Iraq than the combined weight of our intelligence agencies.
So does this connect with the notion of exceptionalism? And we often hear about American exceptionalism, but would you say there's I could say an equal British exceptionalism or something comparable anyway?
Yes, we have our own historic brand of exceptionalism. We have our potent symbols, the monarchy, the military, empire. Yes, yeah. France is the same. They have their version of exceptionalism. But I think America is unique because of the moral tinge that their belief is that America is the only really moral country in the world, that they are an exemplar, that they are the fount of freedom and democracy. We British don't quite go to that extreme.
Listeners will have to forgive me for repeating this, but I often do mention this. The New Zealand philosopher Charles Pigden wrote about conspiracy theories, and in that he said how it's very easy for people to think that their own countries wouldn't do anything wrong, but it's very easy for them to think bad things of other countries. It's kind of a default position. And we all suffer from that.
Yeah.
Okay, so some of these TV appearances, you've mentioned some of them already. What I'd like to ask here is if you could draw upon those experiences to share with us any of the propaganda techniques that you've been on the receiving end of and how you've actually dealt with those. Now, I'm just going to mention a few here that Piers Robinson listed in his presentation. So outright lying, distortion, omission, misdirection, incentivization, and coercion. How many of those have you experienced, and how have you reacted to them and coped with them?
All of the above. And I'd mention another, possibly my favorite, demonization. Demonization of Assad, demonization of Russia, demonization of Putin. Now, this may interest any of the religiously minded listeners. This word demonization, it's been so overused that we've forgotten what's included in that term. A demon, the devil. And I think it's an example of how the religious, which we think has disappeared from our lives, been excluded, keeps coming in round the back door.
Yes.
And reappears, if only in our unguarded moments when we use words like demonization. But there is the mainstream media try to create a whiff of the satanic around Assad in particular. He is portrayed revealingly as a monster, or to quote President Trump, as an animal. Did you catch the very faint suggestion of the Garden of Eden and the distinction between man and the animal kingdom? These hints are just there in the background. So Assad and Putin are being demonized, and what we're seeing, according to the mainstream narratives, is a conflict between good and evil. No grays, it's all black and white. And did you notice how the white helmets, their helmets are white? These are the knights of the Holy Grail, the knights on white steeds who come through to rescue innocent people. There are many religious echoes just below the surface of the situation, as described in the mainstream media and as pictured in the popular imagination.
Yeah, these symbols are very powerful and still with us. I agree. Of course, one of the things about the demon is that it is beyond redemption. And I think there's some sense of that, isn't there? When these various people are being demonized, they are out and out evil, and they always will be, and everybody needs to think that about them. There's almost a kind of otherworldliness or an other species about such.
Exactly. They are monsters. They are monsters. And there's also these suggestions of pollution. They are using poison. They are using gas. They are polluting the well springs of our democratic system. Definitely there's something going on here, something very deep, very spiritual.
That's fascinating. Oh, you mentioned, of course, about Assad being demonized, and I have to say that the interviews that I've seen with him, he just does not come over as a monster. He comes over as a very rational person, very calm, considered. Now, of course, I've said this before, that says nothing about his moral character, but he's not insane and he's not stupid. So certainly the whole picture of him being this great demon, this animal, etc., that does actually make no sense to me.
Yeah. Well, if Assad is a demon, an animal, then we are too, because there's nothing that Assad has done that we, the West, have not done in places like Raqqa and Mosul. You know, have you seen the pictures of the devastation in those two cities? Even greater devastation than in Aleppo or any other Syrian city that has been recovered by the Syrian government. In Raqqa, they're still pulling the bodies of babies out of the wreckage. And the Americans are not giving any reconstruction assistance either. This is demonic. This is morally reprehensible. But it goes unmentioned, unremarked.
Okay, well, let's turn then to the specifics of some of these interviews. I mean, you mentioned the Radio Scotland one, and I did want to discuss this with you because I think it was really interesting the way, I don't know the chap's name, but he didn't actually use ridicule, but I thought he was going that way when he said something like, yeah, but what possible motives could the jihadists have had for, doing a hoax, which gave you a wonderful opportunity for a comeback where you said even a child can see what their motive would be, which I think was excellent.
The key thing there was that I paused. There was a pregnant silence. I couldn't believe my ears that he could be so stupid. And I think that was conveyed with silence, a very brief silence.
Yes, I'd forgotten that, but you're absolutely right. That's why that worked, that comeback. But it was I don't know whether he was really thinking through what he was saying. I got the impression that he was jumping to that technique of, well, not quite ridicule, but you know what I mean? Where you say, oh, but how can, what could possibly this, what could possibly that? Verging on the ridicule, which seemed to me not really a rational discussion there at that point. That sounded like a little bit of propaganda going on there, which didn't work.
Absolutely. If I could jump to another BBC example, it wasn't with me, but with Baroness Cox, a member of the House of Lords, who in April took a delegation to Syria, had meetings with Syrian dignitaries, including the Grand Mufti of Syria.
Yes.
She came back and was interviewed by the very important Today program on radio. Yeah. And the interviewer, he went beyond mockery. He sneered at her. How could she possibly sit down to have tea with a mass murderer?
Yes, I remember hearing that.
Now, the key thing here is that this claim that the Grand Mufti was a murderer was based on a flawed Amnesty International report, information which came from a single biased informant who said that the Mufti had signed execution warrants in their thousands. Well, this is a total lie in the Syrian justice system, which is completely secular. That's the whole point of the war. This is the forces of secularism against the forces of bigotry. In the Syrian justice system, religious dignitaries don't have any role whatever in the administration of justice other than in the Sharia courts. This was not Sharia. It was a fabrication. And on the basis of this, the BBC presenter, and there must have been millions of listeners, felt that he could sneer at Baroness Cox, who had gone out there with the worthy intention of finding out facts of the situation and talking to Syrian leaders.
Yes, indeed, I did hear that, and it was shameful, wasn't it?
Absolutely shameful.
I felt very sorry for her, actually, in that situation. Yeah, I mean, this sort of siding with government positions, it seems to be some journalists wear this as a kind of fur coat, that they're always protecting themselves and cosseting themselves with it. I mean, you came up with that.
If I could jump in with another example, a Sky News presenter at the time of the Duma crisis, Adam Bolton, one of their top presenters, was interviewing me, and I said, the British government haven't even produced a dodgy dossier this time. See, this is me trying to be entertaining as well as informing. Soundbite. Always think of a soundbite before you go on to one of these things. Not even a dodgy dossier. And Adam Bolton took it upon himself to close the interview by saying, well, not yet, but I'm sure the government will produce a dossier before long. They didn't. But he took it on himself to act as the government press agent.
Yeah. And you had a similar sort of thing with, now, is her name Naga Monchetti?
Yes.
This is on BBC Breakfast.
Yes.
I did see that, and she seemed to take the government line on everything. It was like a constant appeal to authority against everything that you were saying, really.
Exactly, and she made sure introducing me to get off on, for her, the right foot by implying that I was on the Syrian government payroll because I'm a co-chairman of the British Syrian Society, as we were discussing earlier. She never says anything like that when she introduces people who really are paid spokesmen. For example, former ambassadors to Washington, former ambassadors to Saudi Arabia. No, they are not introduced in that way.
So, I mean, this is one of the things that frequently baffles people. I find, in my offline conversations with people on this kind of thing, that people find it very difficult to accept that journalists aren't telling the truth. not just because we've learned to trust certain news outlets, but because it seems so unbelievable on the face of it that so many journalists should be lying or being economical with the truth in various ways. But it seems to me that there are explanations for this. I'm going to ask you what you think of it. The kind of thing that comes to my mind is the sort of thing that Noam Chomsky has said, where journalists are enculturated in a certain way of thinking. If they didn't think the right thoughts, they wouldn't be in that job. Another would be that there are people who are paid off or even blackmailed amongst journalists and are therefore functioning as intelligence assets. And maybe you can think of other things. What would you say are the main driving forces behind journalists behaving in these ways, where they should really be holding government and indeed the deep state to account?
Yes, I'm not sure I have the answer, and there are probably several answers, but part of it is simply down to ideology. These are people who are recruited on the basis that they have a certain mindset, a certain cast of mind. They tend to be liberal interventionists, the kind of people who read The Guardian, watch the BBC, get all their news from those kind of outlets, were supporters of the Iraq War, who sympathize with Tony Blair and people like David Miliband, the liberal interventionist culture. They generally come from that background. There are very, very few mavericks among mainstream journalists. You don't get to be a mainstream journalist if you have a maverick cast of mind. There are conformists who will go along with prevailing narratives. It's different with some domestic policies, but you don't have to be brave to criticize a government because it's not spending enough on the NHS or because it's making a mess of the Brexit negotiations. That doesn't require moral courage. Taking a different line from the government on an issue of security, a Middle East war, that would have spared us the Iraq war if the BBC and others had been of a more critical mindset.
So the mainstream media is like a machine and you want good cogs for the functioning of the machine, essentially.
Exactly. You don't get to be part of it unless you fit.
Yeah. But do you think there is an element of intelligence assets within the media who have a controlling influence?
I don't think they even find that necessary because there is so much compliance already. The closest it gets is with the defense correspondents, a pet hate of mine, almost to a man. Defense and security correspondents. They don't get free lunches in nice hotels if they don't toe the government line. And they will dutifully parrot the government line. They really are acting as government press agents. You'll never hear a defense correspondent saying that the latest harumphing general complaining about not enough money being spent on aircraft carriers might be wrong. No. They will always go along with ramping up more military, ramping up more foreign wars. There isn't a single peacemonger among them.
Well, I wanted to ask you another question, kind of an extended notion of propaganda, and this comes out of something that was said at the Media on Trial event, that the very notion of the war on terror is a propaganda construct, which I thought was really interesting. It's like a soundbite that bypasses our reason and manipulates the way we think and feel. It appeals to fear. And when I was thinking about this, I realized there were a lot of other phrases as well that seem to possibly be propaganda constructs. And I thought of responsibility to protect, the white helmets, international community, weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, democracy. These are words we're so familiar with, and we think we know exactly what they mean, but the way they're used can be very propagandistic. Even British values, rule of law, all these sorts of things. I can hear you saying yes in the background, so presumably you agree they can be used in an extremely propagandistic way.
Very much so. A recent favourite has been rules-based system. The British government has become, in the last year or two, very fond of this phrase, rules. The Russians are not respecting rules-based systems. They're undermining, for example, the rules-based system of chemical weapons. Now, in years gone by, governments would talk about international law. Trouble is that we have intervened illegally in so many places in the Middle East that we're now afraid to invoke international law because we are ourselves scofflaws, outlaws, breakers of international law. That is a dangerous concept to invoke. But a rules-based system, when we create the rules, not the law, but we set the rules, is much more convenient for government. And when we don't like what we've created, well, we just change the rules. So Trump, for example, can tear up the rules-based system, which was instituted with the nuclear agreement with Iran. It's no longer convenient. So that rule gets tossed out of the window. And recently, the British government instituted a change in the rules for the OPCW, the chemical weapons inspectors, because it was more convenient. We wanted them to be able to point the finger based on evidence that we, of course, would provide. These are the rules that we prefer. So rules-based systems, watch out for that one. It trips off the lips of government spokesmen with alarming ease.
Yes, indeed. Would you agree that one of the major ways in which propaganda works is just through brute attrition? So you get constant repetition of shallow news reports, endlessly repeating the same kind of messages. It just sticks in people's minds, even if certain elements of those stories actually get debunked along the way. It doesn't really matter because the main narrative is established and reinforced just by repetition.
A case in point, the British government very recently released a statement about the white helmets, how they were being exfiltrated from Syria and brought to Britain. And 7 times in a very short statement, the word volunteers was used to describe this organization, which is composed of jihadi auxiliaries. But by calling them volunteers repeatedly, there was no need actually to keep repeating it, but they know the power of repetition. If you repeat something often enough, it will go. Goebbels, of course, was the first to make this a well-known principle of propaganda, but advertisers know the same. Repeat, 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 volunteer, volunteer, volunteer. And of course, this is how the mainstream media report the white helmets.
I want to ask you one last question here, and this is a tricky one to ask. One of the things I notice in discussing many of these events, that there's a very restricted sphere of discourse because there's a social taboo about saying certain things. For one example, in this whole Novichok business, it was clearly not acceptable to mention that, say, Porton Down might have had nefarious input into those events, despite the fact that it was just down the road and could actually produce this stuff. That's not acceptable to mention. And therefore, it didn't get into the equation when people were deciding who might have been responsible for this. And it seemed to me that this was, I don't know whether one should understand this as a deliberate restricting of the sphere of discourse or not. I mean, it certainly is restricted, and therefore people are reaching illogical conclusions because of that. Do you see it as deliberately restricted in order to manipulate people's reasoning?
Yes, I'm sure the government propaganda machine has been working overtime on trying to narrow down the channels for public thinking about this incident, on which I have absolutely no inside information. I speak with no more knowledge than the average listener. But the government appear to be at pains to exclude any possibility of another explanation, such as an Eastern European power such as Ukraine, which might want to frame Russia. Did it? I've never seen the government address this hypothesis, even to dismiss it. No. And I suspect it's because they would find it very difficult to do so. Yep. So the government are trying to narrow the options for the public to think about this issue, but it appears to be backfiring from what I can see. The conspiracy theories are running rife, and every time the government come up with some new tidbit of information, it just unleashes another round of conspiracy theorizing.
Yes, I take your point about this, but it's not just the government, is it? Because the opposition is not able to think outside this box either. There is this taboo, isn't there? You're allowed to say so many things, but you're not allowed to go into territory that is unacceptable.
Well, the Labour opposition, of course, has two components. The Parliamentary Labour Party, the majority of whom are liberal interventionists, sympathisers with the Blair extreme centrism, these people are very divorced from the Labour Party membership. The outcome is that the leadership is almost paralysed, unable to take a strong position on hardly anything. Yeah. And particularly on issues touching national security, where Labour will always be vulnerable to accusations that they're selling the country short on national security or defence spending. So they're constantly on the back foot. And I don't see that changing anytime soon, sadly.
Yeah. Okay, well, the last thing I want to ask you about then is about us. I mean, how can we avoid the effects of propaganda on our own consciousnesses? Speaking from your own experience, how you've dealt with it, what advice would you give to us? Obviously, we're going to be affected by it to some extent, but what can we do to limit the effects of it as much as possible?
Well, be aware that you're being manipulated. I'm trying to manipulate the listeners right now. We do it instinctively. We can't help it. We try to shape our discourse to influence people. But be aware that governments do this. They pay huge amounts to public relations companies and to press departments to frame our thinking. And a lot of it is down to framing, to narrow the options, to permit only one narrative about a given event. Just be aware of these techniques, and as much of what is not said as what is said, the questions which go unasked.
Okay, and finally, a related question. It's okay for us then to think in our own minds what is going on here and to think critically, etc. But how do we talk about these kinds of concerns with other people? This is another thing that I said to Vanessa, that I'm very aware that people are thinking outside the box about this kind of thing. You just go to even mainstream publications and look at the comments there, and there are lots of dissenting voices. I can't believe this is total nonsense, etc. And yet, my experience is in everyday life that people do not talk about these kinds of concerns. And I think that's very serious. You are talking about it openly in all sorts of contexts. What advice would you have for us in just the general, everyday social interactions to express our concerns about the propaganda that's going on? Because there are pressures, aren't there, for us? We'll be called a conspiracy theorist, a nutcase, and all that sort of thing.
Oh, yes.
How do we cope with it?
Yeah, I just say to people, don't be cowed, don't be frightened. You will probably, if you voice an opinion, an unorthodox opinion, you'll be surprised at how often other members of the public will agree with you. I find this constantly. People I would never have expected to agree with me, they do. Some disagree, but more often than not, I'm pleasantly surprised. And an increasing number of people simply will not just go along with the mainstream narratives, with the mainstream media. They are moving away from them in droves, and they're going to their computers and their tablets and their smartphones and turning to alternative sources.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And so essentially you are calling for people to be brave. So people may actually agree with you when you say what you really believe.
Exactly.
Yeah, good advice. I need to take that advice myself, because very often I wimp out. I mean, I can speak behind the microphone here, but that's a different matter. But in my everyday life, I tend to wimp out. So I will take your advice, Peter Ford. Thank you ever so much for coming on the programme. It's been a delight to speak to you. Very interesting, and a privilege to speak to you as well. And let me thank you for the work that you do in the media, and for your honesty and your bravery in speaking truth to these people who themselves should really be holding power to account and very often are not. So thank you for coming on the show and for the work that you do.
Thank you very much, Julian. Been a pleasure.